Hollywood once sold a perfect dream, but behind that dream were real men forced to hide who they truly were. In this video, we're revealing 10 legendary actors who shaped an era while living in the shadows. Which one of these hidden icons leaves the biggest impression on you? Drop their name in the comments below. Let's talk. And if you love stories that go beyond the screen, hit like and subscribe for more untold truths from LGBTQ+ history. Farley Granger never quite fit the Hollywood mold, and perhaps that's what made him so fascinating. With boyish good looks, expressive eyes, and a natural charm that veered between innocence and quiet danger, he became a favorite of master directors like Alfred Hitchcock, starring in Rope and Strangers on a Train. Granger's performances felt alive, unpredictable, always teetering on the edge of something unspoken. That tension wasn't just in the roles, it mirrored the life he was living behind the scenes. Granger identified as bisexual, and unlike many of his contemporaries, never made a secret of it to those in his personal orbit. He had relationships with both men and women, including playwright Arthur Laurents and composer Leonard Bernstein, as well as actress Shelley Winters. But while he lived with a certain openness among friends, he also knew the limitations of the era. The studio system expected its stars to sell a certain fantasy, and queerness didn't fit the script. Rather than force himself into a lifelong performance, Granger gradually distanced from the Hollywood spotlight. He turned to the stage, independent projects, and eventually writing. In his candid 2007 memoir, Include Me Out, Granger spoke freely about his sexuality and the unique space he had occupied. Not closeted, not out in a modern sense, but honest in a way that was remarkably rare for his time. He didn't paint himself as a victim of the system, nor did he apologize for his choices. Instead, he told his story as it was, complicated, messy, and deeply human. Farley Granger's legacy is that of a man who moved through fame on his own terms. Quietly rebellious, emotionally authentic, and never willing to sacrifice his sense of self for a spotlight. He didn't break the rules with a bang, but with a calm, unflinching grace that still echoes through the cracks of old Hollywood. Sal Mineo wasn't built for the background. With his piercing eyes, intense energy, and air of restless vulnerability, he burst onto the screen like a spark no one could contain. At just 16, he earned an Academy Award nomination for his role as Plato in Rebel Without a Cause, a character many saw as one of the earliest queer-coded teens in American cinema. Mineo wasn't just acting, he was living a truth that couldn't yet be spoken. In the golden haze of 1950s Hollywood, he represented something new, a generation ready to feel more deeply, to question more boldly, and to love without explanation. But the same qualities that made him a star also made him difficult to box in. As he aged out of teen heartthrob roles, Mineo struggled to find his place in a studio system that didn't know what to do with a young man who refused to conform. His career cooled, but his talent never waned. He turned to theater, directing, and more daring roles, often confronting complex, marginalized characters that mirrored parts of himself. Quietly, he began to live more authentically, reportedly entering relationships with men even as the world still expected silence. Mineo never made a grand statement about his identity. He didn't need to. His work, his choices, and his presence spoke for him. He became a quiet pioneer, one who lived at the edges of fame while refusing to trade his truth for comfort. In the 1970s, just as his career was beginning to show signs of resurgence, his life was suddenly cut short under tragic circumstances. But the light he brought to screen and stage never truly faded. Sal Mineo was more than a promising talent lost too soon. He was a young man who dared to feel everything, say little, and let the work speak where words couldn't. In doing so, he became a symbol, not of what was, but of what might have been, had the world only let him fully shine. While many stars of Hollywood's golden age hid behind masks to survive, William Haines made a choice that changed everything. He chose love over fame. In the late 1920s, Haines was one of MGM's top box office draws, known for his quick wit, effortless charm, and irresistible screen presence. Audiences adored him, and studios banked on his rising stardom. But Haines wasn't just a matinee idol. He was also openly gay among friends and colleagues, living with his partner Jimmy Shields at a time when such a life was nearly unthinkable in public. Louis B. Mayer, head of MGM, eventually confronted Haines with an ultimatum: end his relationship with Shields and enter into a lavender marriage to preserve his career or walk away from Hollywood. Without hesitation, Haines chose Shields. He turned his back on stardom and never looked back. It was a radical decision for the era, and one that could have led to obscurity or ruin. But Haines reinvented himself once again, this time as a wildly successful interior designer for the rich and famous, with clients ranging from Joan Crawford to Ronald and Nancy Reagan. More remarkably, his relationship with Shields endured for nearly 50 years, a rare and beautiful partnership that outlasted most Hollywood marriages. The two built a quiet life together in Brentwood, filled with laughter, creativity, and devotion. Their bond remained unbroken until Haines's passing in 1973, and even then, Shields followed just a short time later, unable to imagine life without him. William Haines didn't just survive Hollywood, he rewrote what it meant to win. In an era when being out meant exile, he carved a different path, one guided not by fear, but by integrity. His story isn't one of tragedy, but of quiet triumph, the kind that lives on in both design and defiance. Long before sound swept through the silver screen, Ramon Novarro captivated audiences in silent epics with little more than his eyes and presence. With smoldering looks and refined elegance, he rose to fame in the 1920s as one of MGM's brightest stars. His breakthrough came with Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, 1925, where he portrayed the title role with such depth and dignity that he became an international sensation. To millions, he was the noble, exotic heartthrob of early Hollywood. But behind that image was a man trapped in a life scripted by fear. As a gay, devoutly Catholic actor in the silent era, Novarro carried a burden most couldn't see. He refused to marry for publicity, declined fake relationships orchestrated by studios, and lived with an uneasy balance between privacy and performance. Though discreet, he never truly denied who he was to those close to him. But the industry and the world wasn't ready for an openly gay star. So he built a quiet, dignified life out of the spotlight once his leading man roles began to dwindle with the rise of sound. His later years were spent largely in solitude, far from the glamour he once embodied. In 1968, his life came to a heartbreaking end under tragic and violent circumstances that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. The media spotlight focused not on his artistry, but on the controversy, casting a shadow over a legacy that deserved far better. Yet Novarro was more than a footnote in gossip columns. He was a trailblazer who navigated a treacherous world with grace and quiet defiance. His story remains a poignant reminder of how fame offers no shelter from cruelty, but also how dignity can endure long after the lights fade. His legacy lives on, not just in film, but in the courage it took to be true to himself in a time that refused him space to exist. James Dean didn't need a long career to become eternal. With just 3 films to his name, he embodied the restless spirit of post-war America, wounded, misunderstood, and burning from the inside out. His performances in East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant weren't just compelling, they felt lived in, like he wasn't playing a character but revealing something buried in himself. The slouch, the cigarette, the distant gaze. Dean became a symbol of emotional rebellion in a world desperate for control. Yet the man behind the icon remained an enigma. Dean guarded his private life with the same intensity he brought to his roles, leaving behind a trail of ambiguity. He had relationships with women, yes, but also intimate ties with several men in the theater and film world. Directors, mentors, and companions whose closeness sparked decades of speculation. He never labeled himself, once stating, "I'm not going through life with one hand tied behind my back." That refusal to define or deny himself made him dangerous in a Hollywood built on image. Dean lived fast, restlessly switching between lovers, homes, ideas, always chasing something just out of reach. When he died in a car crash at 24, he was immortalized at the height of his beauty, mystery, and promise. He never had to compromise, never had to play the game long enough to be broken by it. Unlike others who aged in silence, Dean remained untamed, a symbol of what Hollywood feared most, authenticity. His legacy is a question mark, a cinematic sigh that still lingers. James Dean didn't just capture the pain of a generation, he became its mirror. And behind that mirror, many believe, was a queer soul longing to be known, even if only in fragments. Raymond Burr became a household name through stoic, commanding roles that made him the face of justice and intellect on American television. As the star of Perry Mason and later Ironside, Burr captivated audiences with a quiet strength and calm authority. His characters were always in control, respected, sharp, and morally unshakable. And that image followed him into real life, where he cultivated a persona that matched his on-screen gravitas. But behind the suit and courtroom confidence was a carefully managed illusion, one that kept the truth of his identity locked behind a wall of stories too tragic to question. Throughout his career, Burr offered the public a version of himself filled with sorrow, claiming to have lost a wife to cancer and a son in a tragic accident. But those people never existed. There were no records, no witnesses, no graves. What did exist, quietly and steadfastly, was a man named Robert Benavides, Burr's life partner for over 3 decades. While the world saw Burr as a lonely, tragic figure, he was living a private, deeply devoted love story far from the camera's gaze. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Burr never flirted with the press or staged relationships. Instead, he built a fortress of fiction around his personal life, and few ever questioned it. His fame was so rooted in respectability, so defined by intellect, that the industry seemed unwilling, or perhaps too afraid, to pull back the curtain. After his death in 1993, Benavides inherited Burr's estate and quietly carried their story forward. Raymond Burr mastered the art of privacy in an industry built on exposure. His life reminds us that truth doesn't always need to be loud to be real, and that sometimes the deepest loves are the ones the world never sees. Tab Hunter was everything 1950s Hollywood wanted in a male star: clean-cut, blonde, athletic, and effortlessly charming. With a square jaw and a smile that could sell movie tickets on its own, he was marketed as the ultimate boy next door. He starred in romantic comedies, westerns, and musical numbers, always cast as the all-American heartthrob. Girls swooned, magazines couldn't print his photo fast enough, and studios lined up to cash in on his golden image. But behind that image was a reality so carefully hidden it nearly swallowed him whole. Tab Hunter was gay, something that, in his era, could instantly destroy a career. He knew it. The studios knew it, and everyone worked overtime to make sure no one else ever found out. Publicists arranged dates with starlets for the cameras, while private relationships with men were kept secret under threat of scandal. One arrest at a gay party in the early 50s nearly derailed everything. From that point on, Tab lived with a kind of double vision, knowing who he really was and who the world demanded him to be. He eventually grew tired of the charade. In the 1970s, as his acting roles began to dry up, he retreated from the spotlight. But the truth stayed with him. In 2005, at the age of 74, Tab Hunter finally told his own story in his memoir, Tab Hunter Confidential. He came out publicly and shared the decades of fear, manipulation, and loneliness that haunted his success. The world responded not with outrage, but with admiration. Tab Hunter didn't get to live openly in his prime, but he reclaimed his truth on his own terms. His story is a reminder that behind every Hollywood fantasy, there may be a very real person, quietly surviving the cost of keeping it alive. Before Norman Bates ever picked up a knife, Anthony Perkins had already been battling demons of his own. Slim, intelligent, and quietly intense, Perkins didn't look like the traditional Hollywood leading man, but that's exactly what made him irresistible. In the 1950s and early 60s, he carved out a space for himself as a sensitive outsider, equal parts awkward and alluring. But after Psycho shocked the world in 1960, he was never seen the same way again. The role became both his triumph and his prison. What the public didn't know was that Perkins had long been haunted by a different kind of fear, one that had nothing to do with horror films. He was a gay man in an industry that would destroy him if that truth ever surfaced. From a young age, he engaged in secretive relationships with men, including actor Tab Hunter and dancer Rudolf Nureyev. But he also fought those feelings, internalized shame, and spent years undergoing conversion therapy in a desperate bid to fix himself. Hollywood's pressure wasn't just external, it became something he absorbed and turned inward. Later in life, he married photographer and actress Barry Berenson, with whom he had 2 sons. Some saw it as a turning point, others as another chapter in a life spent balancing image and identity. Even in marriage, he kept parts of himself locked away. When Perkins died in 1992 from complications related to AIDS, many were shocked. Few even knew he had been sick. His death came just weeks before the public revelation of his illness, a final echo of the privacy that had defined so much of his life. Anthony Perkins lived in the shadows of both his characters and his secrets. And yet his performances, layered, anxious, and deeply human, still whisper the truth he was never allowed to speak out loud. Montgomery Clift didn't storm onto the screen. He slipped in like a quiet heartbreak, reshaping what it meant to be a leading man. In an era of brawny heroes and unshakable icons, Clift brought something startling: vulnerability. His eyes carried more emotion than most actors could express with pages of dialogue. With roles in A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, and The Heiress, he captured audiences not with bravado, but with raw humanity. But that emotional depth wasn't just acting. It was the reflection of a man who spent his life at war with himself. Clift was gay in a time when such a truth had to be buried under layers of denial and coded behavior. Despite being one of the most sought-after men in Hollywood, he never played the publicity game. He rejected the image of the manufactured heartthrob, avoided staged romances, and kept his personal life fiercely private. Those close to him knew the truth about his sexuality, his struggles, and the demons that haunted him, but the public only saw the genius on screen. A near-fatal car accident in 1956 shattered his face and changed everything. Though he continued to act in critically acclaimed roles, the light in his eyes dimmed. The pain, both physical and emotional, drove him into addiction and isolation. Hollywood labeled his decline the longest suicide in history, but that phrase ignores the courage it took to live honestly in a world that demanded fiction. Clift refused to conform. He suffered for it, but he never stopped creating, never stopped feeling, never stopped being the most human man in a world of illusions. He left behind a legacy of tenderness, depth, and quiet rebellion. Clift didn't just act, he bled on screen, and in doing so, he became something Hollywood rarely allowed: a star who was more soul than spectacle. Few stars in Hollywood's golden age embodied the fantasy of masculinity quite like Rock Hudson. With his towering height, chiseled features, and disarming smile, he was every studio's dream leading man. He romanced Doris Day on screen, conquered box offices with effortless charm, and became a cultural symbol of the all-American heartthrob. But beyond the camera flashes and glossy magazine covers, Hudson lived a far more complex and painfully hidden life. In reality, he was a gay man forced to mask his identity under the pressure of a system that would have destroyed him if the truth came to light. Born Roy Scherer Jr., Hudson was transformed by the Hollywood machine into a fantasy figure. He played the role so well, the public never questioned it. Behind the scenes, however, he moved carefully through a secretive world of coded glances, trusted friends, and private romances that could never see daylight. Studio heads arranged fake dates with actresses. Tabloids were fed lies, and all the while, Hudson bore the heavy weight of pretending to be someone he wasn't. Every single day. It wasn't until 1985, when he passed away from AIDS-related complications, that the world finally saw the man behind the mask. His death didn't just expose the secret he had carried for decades. It forced America to look directly at the AIDS crisis and the cost of silence. Suddenly, the disease had a face, and it belonged to someone the world loved. Hudson's passing marked a cultural turning point, making him an unintentional but vital figure in LGBTQ+ and AIDS awareness. Rock Hudson may never have spoken his truth publicly, but in death, he spoke volumes. Do you believe Hollywood today would have given him the space to live authentically? Let us know what you think in the comments. These men helped build the Hollywood dream, even when they weren't allowed to live theirs. Which story moved you the most? Let us know in the comments. We read them all. And if you want more stories that reveal the real faces behind the fame, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to LGBTQ+ Vibes. Because every name we remember is one step closer to the truth they were never allowed to speak.